Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the book of Job, Sefer Iyov, chapter 34, Perek Lamed Daled. We are up to verse 21. We just read to the end of verse 20 in 34a, so we're beginning the second half and going to hopefully finish chapter 34 today. We are reading the speech of Elihu. We are in the middle of Elihu's speech, which is going to go on for several further chapters, in which Elihu is going to make a lot of very interesting points that are very different from the points which the friends of Iyov made and Iyov himself. Just to summarize, the friends of Iyov looked at the world as very simplistic justice. We do good, God gives us a good life. We don't do good, God punishes us. If you're suffering, you must be a bad dude, and so on, right? Whereas Iyov then said, no, it's not how it works, because I was good and I suffered, so I don't understand. And then Iyov begged God for chachma, for wisdom, to understand what's happening. Elihu starts to answer Iyov by stating, the conclusion that one would make based on what you're saying is that the only reason to serve God is because of the material reward that one gets, and therefore, since you're not getting material reward, God is unjust. And then he proceeded in the first half of this chapter 34 to say that it can't be that God is unjust. It makes no sense. God is the creator of the universe. Why would he create a world to be unjust? Right? We know he has the power to make everything happen. He does make everything happen. In 1 second, he could stop and the whole world would disappear. We would all return to dust, to nothing, right? To state that God would create a world that has no justice in it, that doesn't make any sense, right? So, and then he continued, the God has no reason to flatter us. God has no reason to pay us off. He has no need that we can fulfill, that he should treat us well. He has no reason to be angry at a person who does bad. God doesn't suffer when we do anything bad, that he should have to punish us. God has no reason to be jealous of us, that he should treat us. None of these things make sense to him. So then he continues in verse 20. He made all those statements in the first half of chapter 34, and now he goes on, Elihu, to state more philosophical ideas that are very important, right? God created a world. It doesn't make sense to say either that he made a world and then he doesn't care about it. He doesn't watch it. He doesn't see it. Ki einov al darche ish. This is verse 21. He pays attention to the ways of man, and he watches every step we take, right? To state that God would create a world and then just chuck it out there, it doesn't make sense, right? He knows what's happening. He knows what's going on. There is no dark, shadowy place where sinners can hide, where God doesn't see them. He knows what we're doing. He knows exactly what we're doing. So you can't say that he made a world and then he just ignores it, right? Kilo al ish yasim od lahaloch el bamishpat. For since he controls it, and since he knows what's happening, and since he watches everything that we do, right? And he's the one that makes all these decisions, right? He therefore does not place more responsibility on the human being, or more, not responsibility, but more capability in the hands of human beings to question his judgment, right? We don't have the right to go and ask him for justice as if we have a role to play in the process of justice, in deciding what's just and what's not just. We can't go to God's court, so to speak, and present our case and expect that we should influence that judgment. It doesn't work that way, right? Human being, we don't have the opportunity to go to God to be judged. That's just not the way it works, right? God makes the judgment. He decides to judge, because we have no power over these things, because we have no capability of understanding these things. Yoroa kabirim lo cheker. Here, I'm going to kind of translate this verse 24 and the next several verses as referring to a little different than most of the commentaries. Most of the commentaries understand kabirim here, the powerful ones, that Yoroah, God does bad to them. He breaks them, right? Lochiker, without any number. In other words, with despite numbers. Numerous numbers of powerful people, in other words, powerful human beings on this earth, he crushes, right? To show that God has no, reason to flatter them, and God will punish them. But I think that this kabirim actually is referring back to the great people that are righteous, right? That there are numbers, many, many numbers of good people, powerful, strong, good people who have been treated badly, like you, Eov. And in many cases, they were in positions of leadership, and God took them down and placed others in their place. You'll see in a minute why I choose to say this. Right now in this verse, it might not sound right, but I'll show you in a second. So verse 25, Lochein yakir ma'bodehem, right? And here it is, thus, right? When he does this, what he is doing, right? God knows their deeds. He knows what they're doing. V'hafach laila v'yidako. And a day passes or a night passes, and they are crushed underneath this terrible suffering. And tachas rishaim sifakam, and they end up being treated together with the evil people. B'makom roim, in a place where people see them suffering. Remember, if we think of these verses as a reference to people like Eov himself, Eov was a leader, and now Eov himself stated, if you remember, just in the last podcast, in the first half of this chapter, he said, I ended up, in the place sitting with all of the evil people, right? Eov said in verse 8, "V'arach lechevron poliavan," and now who am I hanging with? I'm hanging out with the evildoers, and v'lachas amanchei resha. I'm walking with the evil people that are that are now wallowing in their suffering. That's me. I'm with them, right? And Elihu is saying many times God does this, right? And then as we go on in verse 27, I'm going to say Asher al Cain. Some people translate this, right, because of what they have done. If you understand the last few verses as referring to God crushing evil people, not what I think it means, which is God crushing the good people, right? Then you would say Asher al Cain, that this happened because Soru Me'achrov, they have turned away from God. I think this is just, I don't think that's the proper understanding here. I know that, obviously there's different ways to understand it, but I think what this means is that this al-kain is not because of, but it means therefore, right? Asher al-kain, that therefore those kabirim Soru Me'achrov, they turned away from God because b'chol derachav lo hiskilu, because they did not understand all of his ways. Remember, the key thing Elihu is accusing Eov of is not that he was a bad person and did bad things, but that he lacked hiskilu, he lacked understanding, right? And when he received that suffering, they ended up turning away from God, which is what Elihu is accusing Eov of doing. Because he's accusing Eov of still maintaining that simplistic understanding of God, that the only reason why I serve God is in order to get reward. And if I don't get reward in this world in a tangible, measurable way, then I don't understand the purpose and the point. And because they don't understand, when they do suffer, they ended up turning away from God. They ended up failing that test. However, when God acted to these righteous people in this way, lahavi olav tza'akas dal, right? So many commentaries understand this, that God listens to the cries of the poor. I don't think this means that at all in the context of the way I've been translating these verses. Lahavi olav tza'akas dal means, right, that God is bringing upon this righteous person who is now suffering, to bring upon him the cries of the poor. In other words, make him cry the cry of the poor. When we are in this situation, right, while we don't understand why we are suffering, we can use the opportunity to understand the cry of the poor, right? Something that Eov, no matter how empathetic, and no matter how charitable, and no matter how honest he was when he was wealthy and things were good, he didn't truly understand what it meant, to be poor, to be impoverished, to be suffering. Now that he's going through this experience, he can identify with those people that, yes, it's true he helped them before, but now he can identify with them and become even better. V'tza'akas aniyim yishma. And now he can hear the cry of aniyim. I don't think this he is referring to God, which is what many people translate it as. I think this he is referring to the he who is a righteous person, but instead of not understanding, right? Instead of saying, I don't, instead of sticking with his simplistic understanding of God, he simply accepts the situation that he's in and uses it to become a better person. This reminds me tremendously, and I think I mentioned this book before in some previous podcasts, but I highly advise reading, if you haven't, the book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, and Viktor Frankl discusses his experience as a prisoner in the concentration camps in World War II and during the Holocaust. And one story that I was speaking with my son about recently that stuck out to him from the book was how after he was liberated, when he was wandering through the fields near the concentration camp after the camp was liberated with a fellow former inmate, and they were walking through a field of oats, and his friend just walked through it and trampled on some of the oats. And he said to him, "No, we shouldn't do that." And the guy says, "I just lost everything. Look what the people did to us. I lost my family. I lost my community. I lost everything I had. I went through so much suffering. I should care about a few oats." And Viktor Frankl answered, "Yes, no matter how much we suffered, no matter how low we came, we should never become perpetrators. We should never, that's never an excuse for us to do injustice to others." But what this story really personifies is the idea that in that suffering, a righteous person, and in this case, someone like Viktor Frankl, recognizes what it means to take away from others and therefore becomes an even better person. Not that he was a bad person before, and not that this explains why God does it, but it explains what a righteous person is supposed to do when he is confronted by such a situation. And that is to use that situation to become an even better person. And then he continues in verse 29, right? And here the who is referring to God in verse 29. Vuhu yashkit umi yarshia, right? So when he is silent, when God does not answer our prayer, in other words, when this righteous person we were talking about before is praying and praying, right, and God decides to be quiet, how can you fault him, right? How can you condemn him? How can you say that God is at fault, right? In other words, we have no right to think that we know God's justice. V'yaster panim, when God hides his face from us, umi yishurenu, who is the one that can see and understand, right, his reasons for doing this? You can't pretend to explain. Eov was pretending, at least Elihu is accusing Eov of thinking that I understand God, because I know when everything was good and great and I'm acting well, I have money, I have fame, right? That makes sense. I get it, right? That's what Eov said before. But now I don't get it. But he's pointing out to you that nobody gets it. You have to recognize when God is yaster ponim, when he hides his face, no one understands it. V'al goy v'al odam yochad. This is true the way God treats individuals, and it's true the way God treats groups and nations, right? Who can claim that they understand it? Mi meloch adam chanef. This is verse 30. Mi mokshe am, right? For God rules, right? He is the one that rules, not an Adam Chanef, not a human being who has to flatter others in order to gain favor. God, remember we mentioned before in previous verses in this chapter, right? God has no need for Chanifa, to flatter others in order to gain favor, right? Right? For God is the one who rules, not an Adam from the Mokshe Am, right, who has to flatter up to the ones who oppress the people in order to gain favor. Ki el amar nasasi lo echbol. This is verse 31, right? For the has this person, the person who is suffering, the innocent person who is suffering, has he said to God, right? I will carry my burden, right? Lo echbol, I will no longer do any sin. I will no longer, in other words, I will use this opportunity to become even better. I will accept my burden because I don't have a choice. This is the burden that I have, right? Oh, in other words, what Elihu is saying is not that he's justifying the suffering, but he's saying when you're in this situation, what choice do you have other than to say, Nasasi, I will carry it. I will not do more, right? I will be even better. I will not, there's some places that I can improve because we all can improve. Bil adei echazeh atohoreni, right? Without my being able to see, right? This is verse 32. This is again the righteous person saying, I have the image in my mind of Viktor Frankl from that book, but I'm just saying the righteous person going through the suffering, and Elihu is telling Eov, this is what you should do, right? Without my being able to see and understand the reason and purpose for the suffering, you are still teaching me, God. You are still teaching me lessons of what it means to be oppressed, what it means to feel poor, and therefore I will use this to be even better. Im ovel pa'alti lo osif. If there's anything that I have done wrong, I will not continue to do it. In other words, I'm not saying that, not whether or not the sins that I've done or the mistakes that I've made or the faults that I have somehow justify. I'm not looking at it as a scale of justice. Do I deserve to be in this situation? But no, I am in this situation. Nasasi, I have to, like he said in verse 31, Nasasi, I have to accept that situation. And if there's anything in my personality that I can change, anything that I can improve, lo osif, I will no longer do that. Right? In other words, I will no longer do that bad thing. I will be a better person. Because in verse 33, right, and this is Elihu speaking in the words of God Himself. Hame imcha yishalemena, right? Ki ma'asta, right? Is it from you, right, that I decide the payments, right? Ki ma'asta, that you have decided, therefore, to say, that you therefore have the right to say, I decided wrong. So, God is turning to Eov saying, are you the one that decides whether I'm right or wrong? Right? I should ask you whether I'm right or wrong. Ki atotivcha, are you the one that makes the choices? V'lo ani, not me. Umaya data daber. If you know something I don't know, it's like God speaking sarcastically. He was kind of paraphrasing it. You know something I don't know, let me know. Right? Obviously, that's a silly thing to say. Right? Anshe levav yomru li. People that have understanding, right? Remember, Elihu has been emphasizing that Eov should have understanding. Yomruli, they're the ones that speak to me. V'gever chacham shomeal, and a person, this gever is how he referred to Eov before in a sarcastic tone. It says saying Eov was this great guy, but he did not have chachma, he did not have wisdom, understanding. But a gever, a chacham, a smart man, an intelligent and a wise man, right? Shomeali, they hear me, they listen to me. Right? They understand the point that I'm trying to make, right? Eov lo bedasi daber. How Eov is not speaking with understanding. Udvarav lo v'haskel. His words lack, this understanding, this special wisdom and knowledge, right? Because this is the point that he's been making the whole time. Avi, it is my desire, says Elihu. And again, I'm going to translate this next two verses that complete this chapter, a little different than many of the commentaries. Avi bachein Eov ad netzach. It is my desire, right, that Eov should think yibachein. If we go back to verse 3, just look for a minute where in this very chapter, he said to the Eov, right? Elihu said to Eov, Ki ozen milin tivchan. I want you to listen to the words that I say and test them out, think about them, right? Tivchan means challenge them, test out the arguments. So now he's going back and saying, Avi, it is my desire that Eov should think about these arguments ad netzach, forever. Al tishuvos ba'anshe oven. I want Eov to go through this process and think regarding his statements about those who are sinners, right? Eov made statements about those who are sinners. Those are the sinners who deserve to suffer. And Eov repeatedly said, and now I am walking amongst those who are suffering. I'm being treated as if I was one of those people. Think about those statements, right? Because if Eov would do that, right, verse 37, if Eov would do that, then ki yosif al chataso, right, pesha beinenu yispok v'yerev amorov el. Then what Eov would realize, right, is that those Anshe Oven that Eov was talking about, right? Eov's words about Anshe Oven, the evildoers from the end of the verse we just read, right? That the Anshe Oven, in other words, those people who are suffering and those people who are evildoers, that they add to their sin, right? When they suffer, right? Ki yosifa chataso, he adds to the sin. He makes it worse when he suffers and doesn't get that he's supposed to accept the suffering and use it to become a better person, use it to be a way to understand those that are suffering, to empathize with them, right? And he continues to claim, I don't deserve it, and he doesn't use that opportunity to become better. Pesha beinenu yispok, he ends up adding more and more sin among us and increases it, right? Instead of using that opportunity to become better. In other words, so because that's the real only choice one has when one is going through suffering. V'yerev amarav le'el, and instead, what does he do? He turns his words against God and starts to argue with God. Don't argue, accept the situation and use the opportunity to become better because you don't have a choice. And again, it's hard for me to say this because in any of us that don't have the kind of suffering that we're reading about. But when you read books like from Viktor Frankl, who has the right to speak, who knows what suffering is, they can still go through that experience and make themselves a better person, with that experience that they can't explain, that they can't justify. There is no way to justify, but you can still become a better person and use it. This completes chapter 34. Thank you so much for studying this together with me. We'll continue in chapter 35 with Elihu's speech. Have a wonderful day.